Hello and welcome back to NewsX World. I'm Kriti Mehta and you're watching Focal Length, where we give you a briefing on topics from across the world. Now, Africa is grappling with some of its most severe crises in decades. Sudan is descending into what the United Nations calls the world's worst humanitarian disaster, with mass deaths, displacement and regional instability. In Central Africa, the Democratic Republic of Congo remains trapped in a cycle of violence despite multiple peace agreements. At the same time, elections across the continent are increasingly questioned and power politics, including a shifting US approach under Donald Trump, are reshaping Africa's global relationships. To discuss all of this, I'm joined by Professor Israel Kodiaga, who's Director General for African Affairs at Global Unification International. He's also a core faculty member at the African Center for International Studies and a consultant to governments, NGOs, and major global corporations with deep experience in conflict resolution, governance, and African politics. Professor Kodiaga, thank you very much for joining us on Focal Length. I'll start by asking my first question to you. Sudan has been labeled the world's worst humanitarian crisis by the United Nations, also one which has been the most ignored this year, with an estimated death toll of around 150,000. President Trump has said his administration will now get working on brokering peace, but only after pressure from Saudi Crown Prince. Now, despite Trump previously signaling he did not intend to get involved, why was the US initially so reluctant to engage in Sudan?
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me clearly. Now, the United States' initial reluctance stemmed from a number of or a combination of factors, all from strategic, political, and institutional. First and foremost, you understand that the Trump administration and the US have got this policy of America first. So the deprioritization of Sudan in the broader foreign policy hierarchy focused instead on the Western Hemisphere, specifically Europe, the Indo-Pacific, and of course, the analysts have told us that the US diplomatic engagement in Sudan had significantly weakened. And this was as a result, this was after the departure of its special envoy, which therefore left a vacuum. Secondly, there is the complexity of the conflict itself. You know, in Sudan, it is featuring two military factions with no civilian interlocutors, which makes it very difficult for the US to come in. And then there are deep regional entanglements and no clear pathway to a negotiated settlement. So basically, this made the US makers to be worried with very low prospects of success. Now, you also need to realize that the war has been fueled largely by external factors or actors, including the UAE, Iran, Russia, Egypt, and all are backing different sides, which therefore complicates any mediation effort. This actually is part of the problem. Finally, it's also important to note that the administration's foreign policy posture has always emphasized transactional engagement and burden shifting. If you listen to Trump talking, whether he's talking about the issues in the conflict in Gaza, whether he's talking about the conflict in Ukraine, whether he's talking about any conflict around the world, is transactional. So without a very strong domestic political incentive or clear economic upside, Sudan obviously did not feature or did not rise to a level that was urgent for US intervention. Of course, that is why it took pressure from partners like Saudi Arabia to push Washington to actually re-engagement. This, in my opinion, are the principal reasons why the US did not or was not very enthusiastic to get involved.
All right. Professor Kodiaga, now the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, has also been accused of facilitating atrocities by Sudan by backing the RSF, the paramilitary group. They're widely blamed for mass killings and ethnic violence. How significant is the UAE's role in enabling the RSF's military advances? in your opinion, and should the international community be doing more to publicly confront and penalize Abu Dhabi?
Of course, the evidence is massive. The evidence from multiple investigations suggests, and of course, that the UAE has played a substantial role in enabling the RSF's battlefield gains. There are reports which indicate that Abu Dhabi has actually supplied drones, has actually supplied weapons, and also logistical support through routes in Sudan and Chad. Of course, significantly, this enhances the RSF capability. And analysts also highlight the USA's strategic interests in Sudan's gold, agricultural land, and the Red Sea access, which have shaped alignments or its alignments with the RSF. So these are all strategic interests. Now, the scale of this support has had direct humanitarian consequences. The US officials and human rights organizations have linked, of course, the Emirati supplied material to atrocities committed in Darfur and elsewhere. Now, your question on what the international community should do, whether the international community should confront the UAE is ultimately the question of political will. Because we do know the international community has always played duplicity when it comes to some of these issues. And Abu Dhabi, of course, is a very powerful economic and security partner for very many Western states, including the United States of America, which has always and often shielded it from accountability. So, without addressing the external financing and arming of the belligerents, any peace efforts in Sudan, in my opinion, will remain very fragile. Public scrutiny, targeted sanctions, and coordinated diplomatic pressure are tools, incentives of the external that not done, then I see peace as being a chimera in that.
All right, we lost some part of your answer due to network issues there, so I request you to do some checks, Professor Kodiaga. But I'll in fact start now with my third question to you on the Rwanda and Congo situation. Now, the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda have signed peace agreements in Washington before, yet on the ground, M23 rebels continue to advance in eastern DRC, deepening the already severe humanitarian crisis there. What do you think are the root causes that repeatedly undermine these peace deals, and why do African conflicts so often relapse despite high-profile diplomatic signings abroad?
There is current collapse of peace agreements in Eastern DRC, like in other parts of Africa, are basically a reflection of deeper structural issues which the diplomatic ceremonies alone cannot resolve. First, the conflict is driven by entrenched security dilemmas, which are often ignored. And as long as we ignore these dilemmas, those peace efforts or those ceremonies are meaningless. In the first place, Rwanda views hostile armed groups operating in Eastern Congo, particularly the FDLR, as an existential threat. So that already is a problem. Congo, in turn, sees Rwanda's support from the M23 as a violation of sovereignty. These mutual suspicions persist regardless of what is signed in Washington or Doha. So that is where you start from. You start from the basic and the underlying fundamental issues, which unfortunately are never addressed in those peace conferences. Number two, armed groups such as the M23, they use battlefield gains, of course, to strengthen their negotiating positions. So their recent capture, for example, of strategic towns, even days after the peace agreements, demonstrates clearly that they view those agreements as tactical poses rather than binding commitments. So when they want to negotiate, they actually would want to get into some kind of negotiation tactically to extract some gains. However, they do not genuinely think in terms of peace for its own sake. Thirdly, we must also look at the political economy of conflict. which is rooted in the access to minerals, taxation networks, local patronage, which all create incentives for continued instability. We do know that more than 100 armed groups operate in Eastern Congo, making any bilateral agreement insufficient to stabilize the region. Fourthly, which I really want to stress here, is that peace deals often lack local legitimacy. Agreements negotiated abroad may satisfy diplomatic optics, but of course, they fail to address the community level grievances, land disputes, or governance failures, or boundary issues that fuel this recurring violence. Because, for example, the issue of Congo and Rwanda, there's a boundary issue. The M23 are Tutsi. They live. The Tutsi in Rwanda and the Tutsi in DRC Congo. They are the same community. You talk of the Banyamulenge. They are this same community, but separated through the colonial boundaries. So unless these issues are harmonized, those peace deals will not mean much.
All right. And in practical terms, how much authority and capacity do DRC's armed forces now retain following these agreements? And what does this mean for the country's political future?
First of all, the FARDC remains one of Africa's largest militaries by manpower. That's a fact. But its operational capacity is severely constrained. It suffers from a number of factors like fragmented command structures, corruption, outdated equipment, limited air and logistical capabilities, and in many areas, the local militias or the foreign armed groups have great mobility and firepower than the state forces. These are facts. Now, going further, this erosion of state authority itself has very profound political implications. A government that cannot secure its territories or struggles to assert legitimacy, cannot implement reforms or conduct credible elections, basically is an unstable government. It also becomes increasingly dependent, as you see, on foreign partners, whether they are regional armies, whether they are private contractors or international peacekeepers, which further complicate sovereignty. So, as far as we would look at it, we would say that unless the FARDC undergoes deep and very deep structural reform, the DRC's political future will remain vulnerable to cycles of rebellion, contested authority, and of course, as usual, external interference.
Let's also talk about the question of elections, Professor Kodiaga. Now, several African countries are continuing to hold elections that are democratic in name but produce implausibly large victory margins. From Tanzania, which had near 97% result, and similar outcomes were also seen in Rwanda, Equatorial Guinea, and many other countries on the continent. These are often followed by repression, unrest, and sidelining of opposition voices. What do you say? What structural factors keep producing these outcomes? And how does the international community's tolerance of them in the name of stability ultimately entrench long-term political discontent?
I think this is a very interesting and most misunderstood concept. Every now and then people talk about elections, they talk about democracy, good governance, and so on. But democracy has various strands. And the problem in Africa is that they actually extrapolated a crop and planted it on African soil without clearly understanding the African climatic conditions for this political tool. You see, the ritual of conducting elections after every 4 years, 5 years, and so on is Western, it's not African. And even in the West, they practice it differently. Different countries, different regions have different forms of governance. And the mistake in Africa is that they have been given round poles or to put in square holes. And this is where the problem is. So the overwhelming margins and symptoms are symptoms of structural authoritarianism rather than genuine democratic competition. And this is as a result of several factors. So we do not dispute that there have been issues about these elections. But We have never questioned why do we have to have these rituals every 5 years, for example. Saudi Arabia, for example, they don't have elections, they're very stable. Look at India has a different type of democracy. The US has a different type of democracy. Russia has a different type of democracy. The UK has a different type of democracy. France and so on. But in Africa, they insist on a form of democracy that does not resonate with the lives of the Africans. And as a result, we have all these problems. And the same people who have imposed a system that is not tenable to the African structures coming back to blame the leadership or the people of Africa. But that said, I wish to say the president got over 90%, and so was Tanzania, in an election where people did not participate. So these are some of the problems. Thirdly, you would also talk about the very weak or co-opted electoral commissions, which, in my opinion, lack independence. And it doesn't matter which African country you're talking about. Out of the 54 countries, you'll find the behavior is the same. Thirdly, fourthly, we also have this issue of patronage networks, that the public resources are also given according to political loyalty. So you want a road, you want a dam, you want a school, you want an hospital. You do not get it as a right, but you get it in terms of how loyal you are to the government of the day or the systems that be. These are some of the things that actually impede on coherent democratic practices. Of course, we also have things like repression, intimidation, which suppress dissent even before the ballots are cast. So in a nutshell, I would say there are a number of factors, and the greatest culprit is practicing a system that itself is not in tandem, neither is it in consonance with the African traditional systems. So according to me, when the international community, because you asked me, accepts these outcomes in the name of stability, of course, in quotes, it is inadvertently reinforcing authoritarian consolidation. It is giving short-term calm, which is purchased through that method for the cost of long-term legitimacy. So over time, suppressed grievances accumulate, making political explosions more likely. And of course, genuine stability requires accountable government, not merely predictable election results. So in my opinion, these are the major causes of this matter. So even before we even blame the African governments and so on, let us try to understand, is this system tenable given the African history and cultural way?
Professor Kodiaga, my final question to you now. Donald Trump has repeatedly framed parts of Africa through claims of white genocide in South Africa and the targeted killing of Christians in Nigeria, yet these claims have shaped a more punitive US posture towards those governments. What do you say? What does this reveal about Trump's broader approach to Africa, and how does policy making based on exaggerated or false promises risk undermining genuine security cooperation and democratic accountability and US credibility over the continent?
In fact, the best thing that the Trump administration has done to the world is to expose the US for its hypocrisy, double standards, self-centeredness, and imperialistic tendency. If there is anything that the world will remember Trump for, is by demonstrating clearly that these governments of America, regardless of which party is in power, all they care about are American interests, to the detriment of all the rest. So Trump coming up with such narratives those foreign policy, they have shaped, of course, the domestic political messaging. When Trump talks about white genocide in South Africa, and he goes on presenting a video collected from DRC Congo, this is the height of ignorance and duplicity. And we know very well that the white minority of South Africa massacred the black South Africans for several years. And they said nothing about it. Suddenly Trump wakes up and he begins to champion the cause of the whites, claiming about white genocide without evidence, cooked evidence. He's going about Nigeria, talking about the persecution of the Christians. Excuse me. And we know These ones have been debunked, yet they have shaped the US positions, and they're normally used as excuses for invading other countries. They will always create a crisis, create a storm, bring an allegation when they know only too well that they're interested in that country's resources, they're interested in government change, they are interested in removal of democratically elected leaders and imposing their own puppets. And at any time, excuse me, yes, any time that you see Trump talks, basically it's all about American interests. So that approach, in my opinion, carries several risks. First, it distorts policy priorities, diverting attention from real security challenges such as insurgency, governance failures, and economic fragility. Two, it undermines democratic accountability, as governments now are judged through ideological lenses rather than evidence-based assessment. And the case of Libya is still very fresh in our mind. Three, it of course damages US credibility, especially when African governments and civil societies look at Washington acting on misinformation rather than facts. And of course, thirdly, it weakens cooperation as partners now become wary of unpredictable or politically motivated US positions. So in a word, I would say that ultimately the US policy making grounded in exaggerated or false premises erodes trust. African leaders and citizens expect engagement based on respect, based on accuracy, and mutual interest, not narratives imported from the US to influence domestic positions. This is the truth, and this is the reality as it is.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Professor Kodiaga. Thank you for your insights and for joining us on Focal Length. And with that, viewers, it's a wrap on this episode. For more international news and updates, stay tuned to NewsX World.